Well, I'd just like to start really by thanking you, Iain, for allowing me to come up and have this conversation with you. It's a great sort of privilege and a great thrill for me, I'll say.
Well, it's absolutely wonderful that you made it up here, and I gather by a rather interesting route.
By air, indeed.
By air, yes.
Well, I thought it might be helpful just to begin just by explaining why I really wanted to have this conversation. Because during the last 40 years or so, when I've been working as an artist, I've often found myself described by journalists and others as a religious artist, and as though that were a kind of small sort of subspecies of the sort of great genus. And in the contemporary art world, that's absolutely the case. So it's not unfair, but it's always seemed to me there's something sort of slightly odd about that, because when you think about it, in all the sort of great civilizations, ancient civilizations, in every traditional society that has been studied in, as far as we can tell, throughout prehistory, there's always been an incredibly close connection between image making and religion or spirituality, or however you describe it. And it's only really in the last 300 years that the two things have sort of begun to pull apart. But of course, that's when our notion of art, as we have it today, was sort of formulated, and that's when art history as a sort of discipline really began. And one of the effects of that has been that we've kind of tended to project our sort of current sort of notion of art back onto all that sort of past time. And so it just seemed to me interesting, though sort of difficult, but worth trying to look at it the other way around, and sort of telling that, looking at the last 300 years in the light of that sort of longer story that sort of goes before it. And so that's what I've been trying to do in this book that I've been writing. But as I've been doing that, what's been really pressing on me has been the question was, well, if that there is that close connection, and there just seems to be overwhelming evidence that there is, why is it there? What's the basis of it? And what the way I've been structuring this book is to look at a single picture. It's actually the Fra Angelico's Annunciation in San Marco, and just looking at different aspects of that picture, sort of pattern making, colour and representation and so on. But it's when I got to what I think of as sort of visual metaphor that the question really came into focus. And that's when, for me, your writings became very sort of germane to the way I was beginning to think about that. And so what I'd like to do in this sort of conversation is, though I'd like to get, in the end, to get to that question of why the two things are so connected, I thought we could perhaps start by talking about metaphor. Because one of the things I really warm to in your writings is that the way you talk about it, metaphor is not simply a kind of literary device, but is in fact fundamental to the way the human mind works. Would that be so true to what you're saying?
Yes, I think that all meaning is ultimately metaphorical. Especially, actually, as has been pointed out, in the realm of philosophy and science, we have to go back to embodied daily experience in order to express anything that seems to us rather rarefied. So metaphor is how we understand something in terms of something else that we think we understand. And of course, there may not be a serial process, as that sounds, that you know one and then you know another by analogy with it. But it's more like a picture coming into focus, that various connections between things come to be meaningful. And I think your point about the relationship between images and religion requires one to think about how one can express something that is intrinsically ineffable. I mean, it's in every religion there is this prohibition on the name of God and trying to name things. The Tao that can be named is not the real Tao, and so on. So what we're dealing with is something that is intrinsically very hard to express, if not impossible to express, in ordinary everyday language. And so what we need is something that does so complexly enough and implicitly enough to be able to hint at this very complex and implicit phenomenon. And that means music, which is effectively one very large metaphor, and metaphor in language and metaphor in painting. So poetry, painting and music are the ways in which we can approach the sacred or the divine.
That, I mean, when you, in your books, when you talk about metaphor, I mean, we normally associate metaphor with language, and I think I'm right in saying that, you know, when people first began to sort of see that the hemispheres had different, it was sort of language was sort of located on the left-hand side with Rocker and Wernicke and those people. But the way you talk about it, that actually it's more complicated than that, because though the left hemisphere may process of language, it's not, metaphor is not simply on the left hand side at all.
No, well, the starting point for anyone wanting to approach my writings about hemisphere difference is to forget everything that they think they know about it, because it's all wrong. However, the differences are still very important, even if we've got them a little wrong in the past. So it's a question what they are, and as you know, I've written more about that. But in specifically relation to language, language has many aspects to it, very obviously. It has semantics, as it were, the vocabulary. It has syntax, the way in which those building blocks of language are put together. But it also has many other ways of conveying meaning, including prosody, the inflection of what we're saying, which can reverse its meaning, irony, a sense of humour, metaphor, which play around with the meaning, and if you don't actually have those, you won't understand what is being meant. And ultimately, there's something terribly important, despite its rather basic sounding name, pragmatics, which effectively is the crown of the whole thing. It's what does this utterance really mean in context? And the same phrase, the same word, uttered on a different occasion, in a different way, in a different setting, could have a vast range of meanings, including ones that are frankly opposite to one another when stated broadly and explicitly. And I think it's all that stuff, the more difficult, complex, implicit stuff, that the right hemisphere is particularly good at. The left hemisphere has extremely rich semantics and a more sophisticated grasp of syntax than the right hemisphere. But in some respects, it's rather like a computer using language. The image of the brain as a computer is one of the scourges of our age, so I try to avoid it, because the brain is nothing at all like a computer, and I've written a lot about that, in particularly The Matter with Things. But in one particular respect, the left hemisphere is rather like the brain's personal computer, in the sense that experience is better appreciated by the right hemisphere, because experience is multiple, complex, unknown until it's fully present. And this is what the right hemisphere is good at. Then aspects of that can be unfolded in ways that enrich the meaning. And for that purpose, the data, as it were, as we would put them into a computer, the computer doesn't know what this means, but it carries out programmed, according to rules, programmed procedures, which add to what we can understand. That's why we put it into a computer. Take human beings far too long to do that, so we give it to the machine. When the machine produces a result, once again, the machine doesn't know what that means. It has to be taken back into the real world to have its meaning. And those bits at the beginning and the end of the process are where the right hemisphere is particularly important. The procedural bit in the middle, the analytic serial process, is what the left hemisphere is gifted at. But what we know is that when meaning is either unusual and unexpected, complex, or highly implicit, then the right hemisphere is brought into play to understand it.
So could you say that that in a sense the sort of hemispheres, insofar as they deal with metaphors, they deal with them in very different ways. That the left hemisphere is almost like that sort of one-to-one kind of. So I mean, red is stop and go is green, as it were, and that's the way it does it. Whereas the same colours, for instance, the right hemisphere might think sort of red is life, it's emotion, it's all those kind of things. Would that be one way of?
That's one way of thinking about it, but we also know that, and this has bedeviled much of the research, that there's a huge difference between a live metaphor, i.e. one that makes us think of connection, which is very much served by the right hemisphere, and what I call a dead metaphor, where we're not even aware that there is a metaphor involved. Such simple phrases as babies are angels or surgeons are butchers, very close to reality in some respects. And these stock phrases, cliches, where the left hemisphere is at home. It's always at home with what it thinks it knows already, is familiar, doesn't stretch it too far, so the left hemisphere deals with it. As soon as there's something that suggests that this is not previously encountered or is complex in its meaning, then it's the right hemisphere that seems to be the one that takes on the understanding of it. So a phrase like clouds are pregnant ghosts. This is left hemisphere. Don't get that one, and the right hemisphere is aware of the different layers of meaning in it. So, I mean, you might well say, but why does that really matter? I mean, why should I care whereabouts in the brain this goes on? And I suppose that comes down to the fact that, as far as I'm concerned, neurology is never just simple facts. It is illuminating, as Wilder Penfield said, the purpose of neurology is to understand man himself. In other words, we are understanding what it is to be a human being when we are exploring these things. And part of the difference between the hemispheres is they have a completely different take on the world altogether. One is concerned with grasping and getting, apprehending without necessarily comprehending. And the comprehending one, the right hemisphere, doesn't have speech directly. Most people, speech is a left frontal function.
Yes. I mean, there does seem to be something very extraordinary about this sort of capacity to. I mean, obviously, both things are very useful. That we need to be able to respond quickly to things in many sort of situations in life, and as well as,
exactly.
I mean, if you're like I am, a sort of painter and a poet, you're sometimes accused of walking around in a dream, which is not always unfair. But so you do need to have, but there still does seem this sort of seeing that this is that this could be one thing, could be another thing, is an extraordinary sort of human capacity. And I mean, in terms of visual things, I mean, just the invention of line, for instance, that lines aren't there. I mean, that when I sort of draw a line, it becomes an edge. It becomes that isn't sort of given, as it were. And you can see it very early on in some of the sort of cave paintings, where you start with using just sort of blowing things around your hand, but then you actually might extend it with making a line down. And where does that come from? I mean, chimpanzees can recognize line drawings, but they don't seem, though they make lovely pictures, they don't seem to use line in that way. And this kind of jump does seem a very distinctively human. I mean, Neanderthals probably did it as well. I mean, it's not that.
Oh, absolutely, yes. And of course, the making of art is a human faculty. But in essence, the point about making connections between things is the root of intelligence and understanding. Seeing how this represents or marries with that is at the root of human understanding. So it's not, to me, surprising that we should make shapes that reflect other things that are not, as it were, explicit in the painting. because there are layers of meaning when we're looking at something and understanding it or experiencing something. There are many associations, and when we make something explicit in a sentence, we've reduced all that penumbra of potential meanings, connections, layers of feeling. We've reduced them all to one simple statement. And the left hemisphere is much happier with non-ambiguous, clear either or black and white statements. Where things are ambiguous or ambivalent, which is essential in art, because they're not just what they seem to be representing in a sort of very objective sense, then that is where the right hemisphere comes into its own. And it has much greater capacity for understanding and being able to, as we say, process visual images than does the left hemisphere.
I mean, your first book, Against Criticism, was that, as I understand it, kind of suggesting that actually that was a kind of left hemisphere way of approaching poetry.
Yes, yes. I mean, that was, of course, long before I knew anything about the brain or more specifically about hemispheres at all. It was before I trained in medicine. But in fact, it's continuous with my interests in my later works. I found as a young man that the business of analysing poetry in seminar rooms was curiously inimical to the thing that it was supposedly illuminating, because somebody had taken trouble to create something that was completely unique. It was also implicit and embodied in its impact on us, not just cerebral. And in the seminar room, we turned it into something that was general, took the message out of it and said, well, that's what it's saying. It lost its uniqueness, it lost its implicitness because the meaning became explicit, and it became a disembodied cerebral construct. So it was really destroying the thing that it purported to love. As Oscar Wilde pointed out, that is what we do.
Yes, yes. I mean, there is something. You have a lovely quotation in the recent book where someone describes metaphor as a tool for creation which God forgot inside one of his creatures when he made him. And I just love that. And it reminded me rather of the beginning of Genesis, where it talks about God making man in his own image, which of course implies that God makes images, but also that if we're in his image, we are likewise sort of image-making sort of creatures, as it were. And that this is actually, as a way of understanding the world, there is something absolutely crucial in sort of making, in just actually perceiving things, that you can't do it unless you actually you find sort of similarities, and you find
you should almost inhabit the experience yourself rather than inspecting it from the outside. So I think a work of art brings the observer, the beholder, the reader, whatever, the listener, to a point where they are almost bringing this experience alive again in themselves. So that seems to tie up with what I understood you to be saying there. But also, of course, mentioning the book of Genesis takes one straight into the difficulties that trying to describe anything to do with one's understanding of the divine leads one to use metaphorical language, mythical language. And myth is not, I mean, nowadays we use myth to mean something that's made up in a sort of negative way. It's not true, but I'm not using it that way. I'm using it in the original Greek sense of mythos, which was a more powerful form of understanding than logos. But of course, some people who have no sense of metaphor, narrative, myth, or anything come along and treat it as though it were a scientific statement about, what God did as a matter of objective record, and clearly completely misunderstand what's being said and don't get near it.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Aristotle uses the word metaphor, but of course he's using it himself in a metaphorical way, because Plato actually uses icon, I think, in the same sort of context. There's a lovely essay by, I think it's an American poet called the Greek metaphor vans, and he just noticed in sort of modern Greek there were these sort of vans going around that said metaphor on the side, just because it meant sort of delivery van.
That's right. Well, which takes one back to the fact that the word metaphor is itself a metaphor, because it means, as in the delivery van, something that carries across an implied gap, which is between the word and the experience that is being evoked. It builds a bridge. And it's the building of those bridges that enables us to find meaning, to understand. So it's absolutely the root of language is metaphor. It's not an embellishment that comes afterwards. It's the bedrock of language. Language can't even begin without being metaphorical.
Yes, and obviously the same is true of sort of painting. that if you're putting a colour there, which is just a pigment, but actually you're saying this is the pigment or the thing that I'm seeing in front of me, which isn't sort of naturally given, as it were. It's a sort of leap. And
what I love is you're mentioning earlier the Annunciation for Angelica, which I think is a scene he did at least 4 times in different ways, and they're all wonderful paintings. But of course, it is about a moment of annunciation, in other words, the carrying across of a message about something to do with the divine and the human. And that is one of the most powerful metaphors in the whole of Christian painting and thinking.
Yes. Well, I think we're beginning to see how this, how the sort of connection between image making and religion. But before we sort of get on, go further with that, there's 2 things that I think perhaps bear on it that it would be worth mentioning or glancing at. And one is, both of which you sort of talk about in the new book. One is imagination, and the other is beauty. So if we start with imagination, obviously it's clear as the word makes clear that the images come in some ways. There's an obvious connection with that, but you say, and very much echoing Coleridge, which that it's also imagination is in some ways absolutely central to the perception of reality.
Yes. I one of the misunderstandings of our age is that imagination takes you away from reality. But I think the absolutely crucial point made by Coleridge and Wordsworth was that the imagination gives one the only chance one has of actually encountering reality. If you just look at it as though it were a projection on a screen, you're seeing a representation of something. But it's only your imagination that can carry you into really seeing the thing as it is, clearing out of the way all the judgments, the verbalizations, monkey mind that's going on in the left hemisphere, and allowing one to be for the first time in the presence of a mountain, a lake, a waterfall, or whatever it is that one is seeing. So fantasy is the other idea that needs to be contrasted with imagination. Fantasy is the faculty whereby we dress up things that we think we know and turn them into something else. So in the 18th century, there would have been plays in which lords and ladies dressed as shepherds and shepherdesses. And this kind of prettiness, which is masking the reality, is exactly the opposite of the sort of thing that Coleridge and Wordsworth were talking about, where one lets all that go and has no preconceptions, but actually comes to experience in an awe-inspiring way the reality that one is facing. So in that sense, it's also bringing it to life. It takes part in the creative process without that in any sense implying that what comes about is added on in a human way. Instead, it's actually just making what is already very creative. The whole business of the cosmos is creating all the time. But our thinking tends to freeze that, to stop it. The left hemisphere wants to represent that in a manageable way that it can slice up and analyze, whereas the right hemisphere is trying to approach the thing as it really is, in which it is always creative, it is always awe-inspiring, truly present.
Yes. And I suppose that's true when you look at a landscape or sort of something like that. But I suppose it's even, if something can be more true, but it's absolutely the case when you're talking about sort of values, that they don't, if you don't have imagination, they don't appear, but sort of things like goodness and truth and beauty are, as it were, I mean, they're real, but they're without imagination. You're sort of blind to them, as it were. But I mean, obviously, all of those are sort of have a sort of relevance to sort of visual things, but beauty, particularly. And I mean, having said that, in the contemporary art world, I found if you mention the word beauty, it's almost as if you said a sort of a bad word or something. People look at you somewhat askance. But it seems to me that beauty is actually just such a fundamental part of human experience that I mean, to exclude it from art would be very bizarre.
It would be the death of art, which I think we, in some cases, are experiencing. In The Master and His Emissary, I talk about beauty as being airbrushed out of the picture, like a Soviet politician who's fallen into disgrace, and that we no longer can speak about beauty. The word is always powerful, and I think this represents an inversion of sense of values. That instead of seeing the value of what is good, what is truthful, what is beautiful, we see the value of power. And it's power that really is the overriding drive of the last few hundred years in the West, and now, of course, in the East too. So that's a shame. In The Matter with Things, my more recent book, I, as you know, devote a chapter to the question of values. And I'm talking about the nature of the cosmos, and I deal with things like time and space and matter and consciousness. But some people may be surprised that I also include values, and indeed particularly the sense of the sacred, which has a chapter of its own. And my point there is that these values are not something that we just sort of make up and paint on to the world. They come out of the world in the same way that the colours of things that we see come. We don't make them up, as it were. They're there, we see them, and I believe that goodness, beauty and truth are, in that sense, ontological primitives. You cannot get behind them, beyond them, or derive them from anything else. They have existence, whether we like it or not. What we choose to apply the terms to may vary, although I think it's fashionable to exaggerate the amount that is the case, comparing one culture with another. Broadly speaking, the things that are beautiful and the thought good actions in a particular culture will be found to be pretty much also beautiful and thought to be good actions in another culture, with obvious variations.
Yes. No, I think that's true, and I think it's. I mean, that's very much what I've been discovering is sort of looking at this sort of long history. But I think that, I mean, we've sort of, in a way, sort of touched on this all the way through, but that really brings me to the central question that I sort of started with about this sort of connection between image making and religion and spirituality. Because it seemed to me that when I sort of started reading your books, that the sort of central, or at least a central theme of it, was that the kind of lateralization of the brain. At any rate, gives us a way of understanding ourselves and our I mean, the first book, or The Master and His Emissary, of actually human history. You can look at it in that way. And in this the recent book, as you were saying, you look at these sort of big sort of philosophical questions. And so I wondered, do you think this gives sheds a particular the brain lateralization sheds any light on what is, historically just obvious? I mean, you said this a little bit at the beginning. Perhaps we could go a bit further with this obviously really deep connection for 100,000 years or so between image making and these kind of spiritual issues that I mean, you could almost, it's been talked of as kind of co-evolution of the things, that the two things almost sort of grow together. And that's sort of one way of thinking of it. But does your sort of take on this, the sort of, the sort of, I don't know, lateralization hypothesis, if you call it that, but it seems to me that you've actually, it's almost stronger than the hypothesis now at this stage, but...
Well, yes. As you know, I believe the Reformation, not a coincidence that it should take place at a point in which we became more willing to see things in terms of external objective facts. And of course, I'm not suggesting that there aren't truths that we understand from our experience. Of course there are. But this rather special way, a rather black and white or either or mentality, which led to the destruction of images. And I think that where images are destroyed, there's a misunderstanding of their nature, their true metaphorical nature. Because, as I say, a metaphor is a bridge, it's a betweenness. But for the reformers, either a statue of the Virgin Mary was the Virgin Mary, which clearly couldn't be the case, or it was just a lump of stone or wood, in which case it was very wrong to, as it were, adore it. But that is a complete failure of understanding its metaphorical nature, that it's neither just a simple piece of wood or stone, nor is it, of course, the Virgin Mary or Christ or whatever it is. And actually, despite what the Reformers thought, very few people in the world before the Reformation thought that what they were looking at when they looked at an image was the real thing. They understood its metaphorical nature, which is also the nature of icons in the Orthodox Church, that they are venerated, not because it's not a choice between either this is the scene that's represented on either the face of Christ or a saint or whatever it is. It's not that, but it's also not merely a piece of wood. It is something rather special that carries us across to make a connection with a world that is not the everyday world. And in that sense, that is utterly intrinsic to the relationship between the spiritual realm and art. Indeed, it's odd that we have to stress it, as it's odd that we now have to apologize for using the criterion of beauty in evaluating a work of art. In any other era, in any other place, this would have seemed nonsensical and as though we'd lost our direction, which I think is a fair judgment.
Yeah, well, you have, there's a lovely quotation that I think it was from Tarkovsky, you include in the book, where it says he says that the allotted function of art is not as often thought to put across ideas or to propagate thoughts. It's to serve as an example. The aim of art is to prepare a person for death, to plough and harrow his soul, rendering it capable of turning to good, which I mean, but maybe coming a little strong. I know you apply it to P.G. Woodhouse or something, but still, I absolutely, I really resonate with that.
Well, Tarkovsky is for me simply the greatest filmmaker of all time. Yes. And it's rather like Sauterne, in which there's one first grade, which is Ikem, and after that there's all the rest. But as far as I'm concerned, there's Tarkovsky, and then there are filmmakers who are better or worse. But Tarkovsky is in another league altogether. He's the only artist of which I think you could